Good morning, everyone. I'm often asked what a provost does. Yesterday, my daughter Andrea, who turned 18 yesterday, told me about a Gilmore Girls episode where they were all trying to figure out what a provost was. They decided it must be something that you eat. But as provost, from time to time, I'm asked to introduce programs and themes, and I've been asked to set a frame for this year's Convocation series, and its theme, Origins and Originality, Keeping the Faith. I'm going to get at this with a metaphor, in a movie, and a brief conversation with some guests, with very special guests. First, the metaphor. This summer, I tried to get in better shape by doing a lot of bicycling, especially with my two sons, both of them college students, home for the summer. We made our way through lots of beautiful back roads and ocean fronts in the North Shore. It all made me quite nostalgic for the days during my college years and into my 20s, when my friend Jeff and I would ride our bikes along the coast of California. Believe me, we were not Lance Armstrongs, but we did manage to tie our sleeping bags onto our heavy 10-speed Schwinn bikes and cover the 700-mile stretch between San Diego and San Francisco. No stretch of that road was more memorable than Route 1 along the Big Sur coast, the 120 miles between Morro Bay and Monterey. Here the land is often pristine, the highway is often carved out of the cliff. There are many thousand-foot climbs and descents. There are winding roads and lots of nervous drivers. It's magnificent scenery. But to be honest, you spend most of your time staring at the white line along the edge of the road. And there are good reasons for this. If you're climbing, you don't want to stare at the top of the hill, or you'll get discouraged by your slow progress. If you are descending, you want to keep your balance and not crash, not swing too far out into the anxious traffic or too near the cliff. You have to occasionally navigate your way through fragments of shale or pine cones that have fallen onto the edge of the road, or maneuver through the roadkill, the squirrels and raccoons, and all the stuff that Professor Keller would love. But once in a while, you reach a vista point where you can pause and stare over the horizon, where you can see where the road has come and where it heads, where you can soak up that sense of belonging to the vast panorama in a way that's not available to you in a car. You can feel the wind. You can feel the heat as it softens and expands the asphalt, the sound of the waves as they take one more minuscule slice out of the Precambrian rocks. Those bike rides along the coast were one of the things that instilled in me a sense of wonder, and a wonder that sought understanding. Riding always gave me a spirit of kinship with the coast, an eagerness to learn more about its geology. There were parts of it, like Morro Rock here, that were once a chain of old volcanoes that had been rounded with time. I was intrigued also by the macrocarpus cypress trees, some nearly 2,000 years old, that were once part of an immense forest. Frankly, life for many of us at the college, students as well as faculty, and even provosts, can often seem like staring at that white line. We learn to be dutiful, we sweat, we strive, we pedal to keep from falling. We focus on the immediate things right in front of us, the next test, the next paper, the next reading assignment, the next presentation or text message or phone message that we need to return. At times it seems life goes so fast downhill that we might lose our balance, or the climb uphill is weighty and nearly unbearable. But convocation is a vista point. Think of it as an opportunity to catch your breath and stare more fully at the horizon, at the various roads ahead. It provides an occasional glimpse at the larger panorama in the world of ideas. It encourages us to see the motions of our culture, the nature of our global world, and the reach of the church. And we do it together, looking up from our specific path on the road and having a common touch point that can shape our conversation among one another. Sometimes we convene near the big stage here as a full community. The Convo program also includes more than what we do here just on Friday mornings. There are an array of events, smaller venue lectures, discussions, film series, and performances. This year we will actually have a few less Friday convos so that we can allow some special opportunities, especially for the first-year students, to meet in smaller groups. And we hope that like a good oceanfront vista, convocations inspire a sense of wonder. In fact, one of the strands of our convocation program has been a lecture series known as Faith Seeking Understanding. That phrase comes from St. Anselm, the 11th century Bishop of Canterbury, as part of his ontological arguments for the existence of God. Anselm is not implying that faith is an inferior state that needs to be replaced by reason or understanding. Rather, he wants to imply that a love of God inspires an active, insatiable desire to know God more fully. And it requires a little courage, a willingness to look more deeply into the complexities and paradoxes of life, sometimes troubling our simplest assumptions about faith, but driving us to a richer understanding of the creative world. This year's particular convocation theme is Origins and Originality, Keeping the Faith. And let's face it, keeping faith can occasionally be hard. In fact, according to the Pew Forum on Religion in Public Life, about half of American college students, and only half, will leave college as persons of faith. For faith to survive the kind of fierce scrutiny it often receives in our pluralistic culture, you may need to seek a fuller understanding, a fuller vista on the origins, vitality, and originality of Christian belief. To be honest, I've had some dry moments in my own faith life. And those have usually come when I've been overly focused on my white line, on the small strand of the road that preoccupies me. My own assumptions and rational arguments can wither. At times, my evangelical or even my Gordon subculture can seem insular and disengaged. I need the greater vista, the rejuvenation that comes with a vision of the long horizon of former witnesses of faith and former theological investigations, or the reinvigoration that comes when I see new applications of the gospel message, applications to social and community challenges in places like Kenya and India and Nepal. I can't live exclusively in the interior of my own mind or moment. I need the past. I need the broader horizon. When asked to say a few words about the relationship between origins and originality, I thought right away about the interior worlds envisioned by this year's most talked about film, Inception. One definition for Inception, by the way, is origins. It's a rare movie in the sense that it is a Hollywood blockbuster that has received high critical praise. At last check, I believe Leonardo DiCaprio had just cleared more than $50 million in royalties. And I suspect about half the people in this room contributed to that salary by buying tickets. So many of you have seen the film, or at least know the premise. In some ways, it is a familiar heist story. A bunch of smart, good-looking renegades set out to conduct a theft. Only in this case, the theft brings us to the precipice of modern neuroscience. The thieves, led by DiCaprio, have the technological savvy to enter people's dream states and steal ideas. Actually, they are able to imagine and construct dream states for other people, and then to lure them into those states where the ideas can be stolen. In this case, though, they decide to break a taboo in their craft, attempting something called Inception. Not the stealing, but the planting of an idea, or more precisely, the altering of a memory in someone's mind. Part of what makes the film fascinating to me is that the director, Christopher Nolan, gets caught in his own internal tug-of-war between the attractions and fears of his own fable. Inception, like all entertaining heist movies, glamorizes the theft. And it glamorizes the possibility for scientific tampering with human memory. Yet Nolan also riddles his story with countercurrents. For all the film's vivid computer graphics and dreamlike originality, Nolan is certainly aware that many forms of memory alteration and eradication have already become possible. The film ventures into REM dream states, even as it cautions that originality cannot simply be about escapism, but rather that eliminating our recollection of beauty, struggle, and guilt and sorrow deny us some dimensions of the dignity of life. In many ways, the pivotal line in the film is when DiCaprio tells a young co-worker, played by Ellen Page, that when she creates dream states for other people, she must rely on her own imagination and not create places out of her memory. To let you hear this line, to give you some sense of the whole film, for those of you who haven't seen it, I thought we would watch the 1-minute trailer.
What's the most resilient parasite? An idea. A single idea from the human mind can build cities. An idea can transform the world and rewrite all the rules. Which is why I have to steal it.
Never recreate from your memory. Always imagine new places.
He's hiding something, and we need to find out what that is.
We gotta break out of here. Give him the kick. This was not a part of the plan!
Wake me up! Wake me up!
For those of you who have seen the film, you know that DiCaprio's advice is actually an effort to mask his own struggles. For it is his own memories, especially his guilt and sorrow over his wife and the tragedies that resulted from his first efforts at Inception, that keeps intruding upon his ability to imagine new worlds. He is torn between the attractions of living in an alternative dream state that escaped the consequences of his past. And I do find myself rooting for his happiness, even though I know that happiness is an artificial construction, and it requires him to purge from his consciousness his anguish over his own failures and his obligations to his own children. For me, though, some of the most beautiful scenes in the movie come when the buildings implode and deteriorate, as the world artificially constructed in the dream state crashes into the sober and subconscious realities that he faces. Sorrow and guilt at times are needed to prompt our most creative responses to human pain, to make room for grace. In many respects, it is DiCaprio's advice to avoid memory that is his central delusion. Can imagination be separate from memory? How can we imagine a future? How can we be original without memory? Without a sense that we are responding in some way to the experience of the past. In recent neuroimaging research, Harvard psychologist Daniel Shafter has shown that remembering and imagining mobilize the same brain currents. Other researchers have found that people with severe amnesia lose their ability to imagine. Without memory, writes scholar Kathleen McGowan, they can barely picture the future at all. My hope for this year is that we will discover more fully how memory and recovery of the past, how the big vista can help us shape original and creative responses to human challenges and needs. Now, when I was first asked to speak on this topic, I had no idea, of course, of the big announcement we would hear this week from President Karlberg and his wife, Jan. After 35 years of service here, they have certainly reached a fascinating vista point in their own career at Gordon, and an excellent vista point upon which to reflect on the origins of this school, the progress of this school, and the possibilities for originality in the future. So as they prepare for their final year of leadership at the college, I thought one of the best ways of launching our own series on origins, originality, and keeping faith was by hearing a few of their thoughts about linking the past and the future. And I also thought this would give us a good opportunity now to salute both of them as they prepare for their capstone year. So please join me in welcoming up here to the platform President Judd and Jan Carlberg for a few minutes of conversation.
Thank you.
Welcome, Jan. Welcome,
Thank
boss.
you.
Thank you.
You've had plenty of opportunities, I'm sure, in the last year as you've thought about your future to think about the strong points of Gordon, what you've witnessed over time, and the moments of originality that have been a part of this institution's history. And I wonder if you could identify for us some of those moments where you really saw Gordon exercising some originality, and perhaps even to reflect on what were maybe some of the origins of those original moments. Yeah.
Sure. I'll begin that by commenting that Gordon College began as a missionary training institute in Boston in 1889 under A.J. Gordon. At the time, it had a very focused curriculum. It was to prepare men and women to go as missionaries to Africa. But over time, the faculty and the leadership realized that that idea, which was a good idea, a worthy idea, had to be fleshed out and had to have some underpinning put into it. And so they added some of the concepts of what was known as the liberal arts curriculum. And so the institution, in its first 60, 70 years, was focused primarily on missionary training and some Bible, but then had to be added the humanities and the social sciences, and that didn't happen until maybe a couple of courses in the 30s, 40s, but then as the school developed, moved out here from Boston in 1955, the school realized it needed to become a true college. And so it added the ideas and the curriculum that had been accepted for hundreds and hundreds of years to the study that students were exposed to. Things like the sciences, the arts, the languages of other countries, the world history, etc. All of that began to come into the curriculum. And by 1961, then as a consequence of those ideas being added, the college was an accredited institution. But you can trace that curriculum all the way back to Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and in 400 BC. Some of those ideas that are shaped and formed in their writings that came down through history informed the faculty in the 1950s as they built the liberal arts curriculum we essentially have today.
Mm-hmm. Good. Jan?
This is the 175th birthday of A.J. Gordon, and in preparation for that, some of us have been reading a book that was written about him. Not a very easy book to read, not a very well-written book, but there were some parts of it that were very fascinating to me, and one of them goes back before the founding of Gordon College. It was in 1884, and A.J. Gordon was pastor of the Clarendon Baptist Church, and he was asked to come down to Princeton. They were doing a day of prayer. Does that sound familiar? Mm-hmm. Probably not so much at Princeton now, but it's very familiar to us here. And he went down there, and he saw all these students that were not very happy to be there. I don't know whether that's ever happened here, but he looked out at this audience of college students that were shifting in their seats, and they didn't have any technology to play with back then, but they were not very happy to be there. And so he's preaching, and he was terrified. He'd asked his wife to pray for him before he went down there. He was terrified to stand before these college students and to preach to them and to speak to them. They'd asked him to come back and to do some more speaking, and this was during this series, and he was thinking, this is not going very well. I'm going to plan on heading home on Friday night. But a group of students came to him, understanding how stressful and hard this had been for him, came to him and urged him to stay and to come to talk to them in their dorm. And he went. And out of that grew a number of students who came to faith in Jesus Christ. I wonder if those students have any idea that they may have had something to do with the founding of Gordon College. That connection with students and catching some of their heart and capturing their hearts and their minds in some ways for Jesus and what their lives could be, if that in any way influenced him to found the School of Christ that he did.
Mm-hmm. Good. You've seen Inception?
Yes.
We did, yes.
Kind of like a cabinet meeting, right? Everyone's in different states of reality and consciousness.
Right. But someone is in control.
But is what they're doing legal?
In both cases, maybe not.
I got to be careful here. You're still the boss for a year. One thing that really strikes me about Inception is this fascinating interplay between DiCaprio's desire to try to purge, to create a sense of happiness which gets him away from the guilt and the mistakes of the past, and to do it in an alternative reality. And the director's insistence that even to the very last scene, I know I'm not going to spoil it for those of you who haven't seen it, but the very last scene, there's an intimation that the guilt and the sorrow and the uncertainty of the world keep coming back and imposing themselves. And it reminds me that in many cases, the hard things of life, the guilt, the tragedies, are what prompt originality. If we purge those things out, we accept a kind of placid existence and not respond in meaningful ways in our most original and creative ways. So I'd be curious any thoughts you have about the kinds of difficulties you see in the world which should prompt the originality of Gordon students in the future.
Well, one example that comes to my mind as you ask that question is the experience that I've had in visiting Oxford, England, and walking along the street right near Blackwell's bookstore and the Bodleian Library, and looking at the plaque in the middle of the street there that is commemorating 1555 tragedy where 3 intellectuals were put to death for their ideas. Now that's an extreme example, but it happened. And as I stood there and looked at that plaque, I wondered, how did that event shape us today in a place like Gordon College, where we prize the free exchange of ideas within the framework of faith? We prize the ability to explore new and creative ways of thinking and being. Well, it really seems to me that some of those tragedies of the past, and that continue today in some quarters of the world where people are put to death for their ideas, have given rise to our concept of academic freedom, something that we prize very highly at Gordon College. And it seems to me that as we continue our studies here, we want to underscore the important aspect of freedom within the framework of faith that we have taken to ourselves, and we have that as a foundation so that out of tragedy can come creativity and new ideas and fresh thinking.
Two things popped into my mind, which is dangerous. One of them is last year, my husband and I were in New York, or in Washington for some meetings, and carved out an afternoon to go to the Newseum, which is a marvelous new museum about news. And one of the things that fascinated me was the newspapers from all over and the headlines from all over the world, and little village crier kinds of newspapers to great world-renowned papers. But one of the things that was said is if you go to a place and you pick up a newspaper and all you see is good news, you should be alarmed, because somebody is controlling that media and only getting out the word that they want you to have. One of the things that I've grown to love and treasure about Gordon College is we do not just pride ourselves in saying the pretty stories. We do not just want to have pretty people at Gordon all saying the right things and marching in the same way. Yes, about your faith, there are certain things that we're very cohesive about, we're in agreement on. But other things, there's a wide range for what you think and how you act. And those stories do not always play so well sometimes, but they're important stories, and they're a part of who we are. Not all who followed Jesus had pretty stories, and it's important to have those good, truthful stories. That's part of the originalness of you. The second thing is, when we've been to Orvieto several times, where we have a wonderful program there. And one time we were there near the end of the time when students were getting ready to return back home. And I sat at the table with them in the convent, and I said, when you go back home, is there one idea that you especially want to take back with you? And to my astonishment, to a person, they said, mealtime. And I said, why do you say mealtime? And they said, well, sometimes back home, a meal is something you grab on your way to an event. Go through a drive-through window and grab something, you take out pizza, and it's a very quick thing en route to something else. They said in Italy, the meal was the event. You gathered it, you prepared it, you sat around the table talking for hours and savoring the meal, and then you cleaned it up. It's time to go to bed. There are lots of things that you'll learn in your time here at Gordon, and I hope one of the things you do is study somewhere else besides Gordon College. Steve Alter on Chapel on Wednesday said several important things, but two of them. One is, you cannot be one of the men and women or sons and daughters of Issachar and know the times if you don't know other times. And the second thing, he says, you can't know your own country if you don't know another country and have the vantage point and the vista of another country. And I would say that that very much happened for those students that were in Orvieto, that a whole new perspective on something as simple and wonderful as mealtime.
Good. I'm like Steve Alter. I like history, and so there's a kind of excitement about the fact that we have an anniversary. We're observing this 175th birthday of A.J. Gordon. But I know sometimes people think that when you talk about the past, there's this sense that we're just being bound to the past in some way, rather than thinking of how someone like A.J. Gordon could continue to be a spark for creativity, imagination, and originality. So both of you have done a lot of reading and thinking about A.J. Gordon, and just any suggestions about how we might think of A.J. and his work as a prompt for something original and innovative going forward?
I'll tell you one way in which he, even though he wasn't alive in the 20th century at all, he prompted me in a way to come up with some ideas that were not part of our vista at Gordon at that time, and that would have been in 1983. A.J. Gordon was committed to having people understand the needs of the world, specifically in Africa, as I already mentioned. And he was a student of Africa, and primarily of the Belgian Congo. In fact, he focused those first few years of Gordon College, when it was the Missionary Training Institute, on preparation just to go to the Belgian Congo. So the people had to know the language, they had to know something about the culture, they had to know the differences that they would encounter when they got there. Well, let's fast forward now to the 1980s. We were primarily focusing on the United States in terms of the education that we were providing at Gordon. Some world history, yes, but not experiencing the world, other than, very important exception, what we call the European Seminar. But that was focused on ancient history and also on Western history. In 1983, I was given the privilege of traveling through Latin America with a group of leaders and faculty members from Christian colleges. We went to 5 countries. And I totally had my life perspective on other cultures and my life perspective on the U.S. culture blown apart by that experience. We saw poverty. We saw Christians living in terrible conditions and yet having a vibrant faith. We saw the ravages of nature through hurricanes that had occurred in Haiti and what it did to that country. We saw the impact of the gangs in Colombia. And I came back from that experience saying, our students need to have this exposure in their lives. As a result, I proposed to the Christian College Consortium at the time that we launch a Latin American Studies program in San Jose, Costa Rica. And Gordon had begun to make a few forays into that part of the world. Today, it's a major program of the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, and many of our students, hundreds of our students, have participated in that program through the years. So there was an idea that was born out of my own experience, and it has shaped Gordon College to now, I think I read recently that 40% of our students are taking part in those programs overseas.
Good. Good. Well, Judd and Jan, it's not farewell. There'll be a time for that, but we don't have to wait for farewell to say how much we appreciate the work you've done here. So I think let's thank the Carlbergs for their comments today and for the conclusion. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Hope your first week ends very well. Go in peace.